My daughter told me not to come for Christmas. Her mother's new husband will be there. She said, we are trying to make him feel like family. So I spent Christmas Eve my own way. But just after midnight, my daughter called. Her voice was shaking. Dad, why are you on the news? I am Warren, 66 years old, and somehow still healing from wounds my family inflicted. The phone rang at exactly 6 hours in the evening on a Tuesday. I remember the precise time because my eyes were fixed on the bronze face of the mantel clock on my living room shelf. It was Lacey. My daughter typically only reached out when something had gone sideways and she needed me to sort it, or when a vague sense of misplaced guilt nudged her into obligation. I lifted the receiver, half expecting a hurried request for some holiday errand, or maybe a clipped hollow check on how I was holding up. Welcome back to Family Revenge Stories, where the most powerful tales come from real life. Before we begin, I want to ask you something simple. Drop a comment and let me know when someone wrongs you deeply. Do you confront them in the moment? Or do you quietly build your case and wait? There is no wrong answer. I am genuinely curious where you stand. One small note, some details in this story have been shaped for the audio format, and any resemblance to specific real people or events is purely coincidental. What matters most is the truth at the heart of it. Instead, her voice cut through sharp and fast, stripped of any warmth. She skipped past pleasantries, entirely no inquiry about how I was holding up, no acknowledgement of my day. She went straight for the point, informing me that we needed to discuss Christmas Eve. Gideon is hosting dinner at his penthouse in uptown Charlotte, North Carolina this year, she continued. And we think it is best if you do not attend. Those words settled into the cold stillness of my living room like a stone dropped in still water. Gideon was Nadine's new husband. Nadine was my ex-wife. They had been married for 2 years, and in that span, Gideon had made it his quiet personal crusade to scrub every trace of me from my daughter's life. He was a wealthy real estate developer, a man who viewed every relationship as a transaction and assigned a price tag to every person he met. I asked her why, keeping my voice perfectly level. I refused to hand her the satisfaction of hearing my pain. It is just going to be too awkward, Lacey said, exhaling a frustrated sigh, as though I were a child struggling to grasp something obvious. Gideon feels uncomfortable with you around. We are trying to make him feel like part of the real family now. Plus, Dylan is finalizing that massive investment deal with him for the new high-rise. Gideon is putting millions into Dylan's company. We cannot risk making the atmosphere tense. You understand, right? I understood perfectly. I was a liability. To Lacey and Dylan, I was nothing more than a broke, retired old man rattling around an aging suburban house outside Charlotte, North Carolina. They were convinced the divorce 10 years ago had gutted me completely. Nadine had walked away with the liquid assets, the primary residence, and the vacation property. What she left behind, she called my worthless piles of paper. I was discarded because I had nothing of visible financial value left to offer. My presence at Gideon's penthouse in uptown Charlotte, North Carolina, would be an embarrassing relic of a past they were hell-bent on leaving behind. You are choosing your mother's new husband over your own father on Christmas, I said clearly. I wanted her to sit with the exact weight of that choice. Do not make this difficult, Dad, she snapped. Dylan needs this deal to go through. Gideon expects perfection. Your whole worn-out, humble routine just does not fit the image we need to project. We will send you a gift card or something. Just stay home. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice or reach for the respect I was owed. Pushing back against Lacey once she had locked onto a wealthy prize was like pushing against a concrete wall. I said goodbye and set the phone back on its cradle. The silence that followed was absolute, the kind that presses into your ears, heavy and airless. My own flesh and blood had just assigned a dollar value to my presence at their table, and I had come up drastically short. They believed they held all the power. They believed I was helpless, irrelevant, a loose thread easily tucked out of sight. They were wrong on every single count. The quiet living room offered nothing, so I moved down the narrow hallway to my study. The floorboards groaned beneath my weight, and the wallpaper curled away from the edges of the walls. I kept it this way deliberately. The appearance of a struggling retiree was the most effective shield I owned against the reaching hands of my ex-wife and her circle. I locked the heavy oak door and crossed to the bookshelf. I drew a specific volume outward, and a hidden panel slid open, exposing my private workspace. I lowered myself into the ergonomic chair and touched the keyboard. 4 wide monitors flickered to life, bathing the dark room in a pale amber glow. The screens displayed real-time stock portfolios, international wire transfers, and a sprawling web of corporate holdings. The figures scrolling across the top screen were numbers that would have made Gideon choke on his expensive wine. When Nadine dragged me through the divorce courts a decade ago, she sent vicious lawyers to strip away every liquid asset I had. I gave them exactly what they demanded, but I held on to my engineering patents. I had spent 30 years as a structural engineer designing load-bearing frameworks for skyscrapers. I held the sole rights to a specialized steel bracing technology that enabled high-rise buildings to withstand extreme seismic activity. Every major developer in the country paid me royalties to use that design. I was quietly pulling in more each month than Dylan's entire company generated in a year. I kept my wealth hidden to protect Lacey. I wanted her to build something real, rooted in hard work, rather than inherited entitlement. I wanted her to measure a person by their character, not their bank balance. Clearly, that silent lesson had failed spectacularly. She had married Dylan, a man propelled entirely by blind ambition and greed, and now the two of them had sold me out for Gideon's approval. My attention shifted to a thick, rolled-up set of blueprints sitting at the edge of my desk. Dylan had dropped them off 3 months ago. He tossed them onto my porch with a condescending smirk. It was the preliminary design for the Apex Tower construction site, Uptown Charlotte, North Carolina, his company's flagship luxury residential project in the city center. Gideon was the primary backer. "Just give it a spell check, old man," Dylan had said, laughing as he strolled back to his sports car. "Tell me if the drafting boys missed any commas. You have plenty of free time these days." He thought he was handing me busy work out of pity. He thought I was some outdated draftsman capable of checking margins and nothing more. He had absolutely no idea who I actually was in the structural engineering world. Until that evening, I had left the blueprints untouched. I had planned to glance at them eventually. But being uninvited to Christmas, being treated like a blemish on their polished, wealthy image, reshuffled my priorities. I unrolled the sheets across my drafting table and pinned down the corners. If they wanted to play games with investments and corporate image, I was going to examine exactly what kind of empire they were constructing. I reached for my reading glasses and my architectural scale. I started at the foundation plans and worked upward through the steel skeletal framework. Hours dissolved in complete silence. The amber glow from the monitors threw sharp shadows across my hands as I traced the structural load paths of the tower. At first pass, it read like a standard luxury development: glass exterior, open concept floors, heavy amenities stacked toward the upper levels. But when I reached the lateral bracing schematics, my pencil stopped cold. I checked the calculations. I ran the numbers again on my digital terminal. My heart began to beat a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. The math was entirely wrong. This was not a simple drafting error. It was a deliberate, calculated downgrade. The blueprints called for high-grade tensile steel in the primary load-bearing columns, but the attached materials manifest the document Dylan had accidentally left, rolled up inside the blueprints, told a completely different story. They were substituting the required structural steel with a cheap, substandard alloy sourced through a shell company. I cross-referenced the weight of the upper-floor luxury additions, the rooftop pools, and the marble interiors against the yield strength of the inferior steel. The result was catastrophic. The building would not simply sway during a minor seismic event or high winds. It would fracture. The core columns would buckle under the sheer vertical load. Dylan and Gideon were constructing a 60-story coffin. I pulled up the financial projections Dylan had tucked in to showcase his profit margins. By swapping out the steel, they were slashing material costs by 40%. They were siphoning tens of millions of dollars from the construction budget directly into their own offshore accounts. They were prepared to gamble with the lives of hundreds of future residents just to fatten their margins and bankroll their extravagant lifestyles. The personal sting of being shut out of Christmas dinner evaporated instantly. This was no longer about family pride or wounded feelings. This was a massive, lethal fraud. Dylan was the lead developer. Gideon was the financial backer and primary materials procurer. Together, they were engineering corporate manslaughter for profit. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the damning evidence fanned out across my desk. They thought I was a useless old man who would nod along at their success and ask no questions. They had handed the blueprint of their crime directly to the one man in the world equipped to dismantle it piece by piece. I did not call Lacey to unload on her. I did not call Dylan demanding an explanation. Giving them any warning would give them time to shred the evidence and move the money. I needed to move with absolute precision. I picked up my phone and dialed a private number I had not touched in 3 years. It belonged to Beckett. Decades earlier, before he ever set foot in a law school, he had worked a summer job on one of my construction sites. I had taught him how to read structures, how to locate the weak points. Now he was a relentless federal prosecutor, with a reputation for tearing white-collar criminal networks apart at the seams. The line opened on the second ring. Warren Beckett's sharp voice came through. "It has been a while. To what do I owe the pleasure?" "I need you to look at a structure, Beckett," I replied. My voice is hard and cold. "Dylan and Gideon are building the Apex Tower construction site, Uptown Charlotte, North Carolina, Uptown Charlotte, North Carolina. They are embezzling 40% of the steel budget and using substandard alloys. I have the internal manifests and the downgraded structural blueprints. It is a mass casualty event waiting to happen." I heard the immediate shift in Beckett's breathing. He recognized the gravity of the situation instantly. "You have the hard proof in your hands right now?" he asked. "I have everything," I confirmed. "They handed it to me because they thought I was too old and broke to understand what I was looking at." "Do not let those documents out of your sight, Warren. I am assembling a strike team. We need to follow the money trail before they pour the concrete." I hung up the phone. The war had grown beyond anything Lacey or Dylan could comprehend. They wanted a perfect, wealthy Christmas without the embarrassment of an old man dragging them down. I was going to give them a holiday they would never ever forget. I watched the sun climb over the suburban rooftops through the slats of my study blinds. The neighborhood outside was peaceful and completely oblivious to the corporate demolition I was about to set in motion. My coffee had gone cold hours ago, but I did not need caffeine. The sheer audacity of the crime unfolding across my monitors supplied all the adrenaline I required. Beckett was mobilizing his federal task force on his end, but government bureaucracy moves at its own methodical pace. I could not afford to wait. Dylan and Gideon were preparing to pour the foundation at the Apex Tower construction site, Uptown Charlotte, North Carolina, Uptown Charlotte, North Carolina, in a matter of weeks. Once that substandard steel was encased in concrete, proving the fraud would require tearing the entire structure down to its bones. I needed to trace the money right now and sever their supply line for good. I turned my attention back to the materials manifest Dylan had carelessly left on my porch. The primary steel provider was listed as an entity called Summit Core Fabrication. On paper, it looked perfectly legitimate. It had a sleek corporate website, an address in a prestigious financial district, and a portfolio of polished marketing materials. But 30 years in structural engineering teaches you how to spot a phantom operation. Real steel fabrication leaves a massive physical footprint. It demands blast furnaces, freight contracts, heavy logistics, and a legion of union workers. Summit Core Fabrication had none of those things. It was a ghost. I opened a secure encrypted channel and began reaching out to my old network. Decades ago, long before Nadine decided a modest life was a failed life, I spent half my year traveling the globe. I negotiated supply lines, inspected foundries, and forged relationships with the most powerful logistics directors in the maritime shipping industry. My family thought I was just a tired old man sitting through dull conferences. They never grasped that I commanded genuine respect across the international steel trade. I sent a single message to a former colleague who managed freight routing in Antwerp. I asked him to run the import codes stamped on the bottom of Dylan's manifest. The reply came back within 20 minutes. The information was devastating. Summit Core Fabrication was a shell company. It produced absolutely nothing. The steel arriving at Dylan's construction site was not domestic high-grade material. It was being imported from a defunct scrapyard overseas. It was an extremely brittle low-grade alloy, typically used for temporary scaffolding, not a 60-story residential high-rise. Gideon had set up the shell company to purchase scrap metal for pennies on the dollar. He was then selling that same scrap to Dylan's development project at premium market prices. Dylan, as the lead developer, was signing off on fabricated safety inspections, deliberately keeping city regulators in the dark. They were pocketing millions in the margin, funneling the stolen budget straight into their personal offshore accounts. They were paying for their luxury cars, their penthouse suites, and their lavish holiday dinners with blood money. They were perfectly willing to let hundreds of innocent families move into a towering death trap just to elevate their social standing. I forwarded the shipping logs and the offshore banking routes directly to Beckett. The financial trail was airtight. It linked Gideon's holding company directly to the fake steel supplier and traced the kickbacks straight into Dylan's personal trust. Any competent federal judge would look at those documents and immediately issue warrants for massive fraud and criminal conspiracy. But as I studied the structural diagrams on my screen, something else caught my attention. A detail so subtle and arrogant, it made the blood freeze in my veins. I enlarged the digital blueprints, focusing closely on the lateral bracing joints securing the core elevator shaft. The math had already proven the steel would fail under load, but the architectural design of the joints themselves was strikingly familiar. The specific angle of the load distribution, the unique interlocking mechanism engineered to absorb kinetic shock, it all looked deeply, unmistakably familiar. I pulled up my own secure patent vault on a separate monitor and set the two files side by side. My breath caught in my throat. Dylan and Gideon were not just constructing a fraudulent tower. They were using my exact patented seismic damping design to do it. I had spent 12 years developing that specific interlocking joint. It was the crowning achievement of my engineering career, the precise technology that had generated the silent fortune my family knew nothing about. Dylan had copied my proprietary blueprints line for line. He had stolen my intellectual property and woven it into his death trap. He clearly believed that my superior design would somehow magically compensate for the brittle, inferior steel he was sourcing through Gideon. He thought he could steal my genius to paper over his greed. The sheer disrespect of it was staggering. Dylan had sat at my dining table. He had eaten my food. He had smiled at my face while secretly working to cut me out of my daughter's life. And the entire time he was quietly copying my life's work to enable a mass casualty crime. Gideon, the man who had taken my place in my ex-wife's life, the man who threw his wealth around to make me look like a failure, was entirely dependent on my intellect to raise his fraudulent empire. They believed I was a worn-out retiree who could be safely ignored. They had no idea they had handed the original architect of their stolen technology the one weapon capable of dismantling them completely. I printed the side-by-side comparisons and sealed them in a folder. This was no longer just a federal investigation into financial crimes. It had become a direct personal war. They had infringed on my patents. That meant I did not have to simply wait for the authorities to move. I had the legal right to paralyze their operations entirely on my own. Beckett called me back as I was organizing the files. He confirmed receipt of the shipping logs and the financial transfers. He sounded deeply impressed. He told me he had enough evidence to secure search warrants for Gideon's corporate offices and Dylan's development firm. He warned me that federal judges move carefully during the holidays, but he promised the raid would be authorized within 48 hours. He told me to stay quiet and let the authorities handle the rest. I thanked him for his speed, but I knew I could not simply sit back and wait for a raid. Search warrants would freeze their paperwork, but I needed to freeze their actual ability to move money. Gideon was a cunning man. The moment he caught the scent of a federal investigation, he would liquidate his assets, dissolve the shell companies, and vanish from the jurisdiction, leaving Dylan to absorb the entire fall. I could not allow that. I needed to trap him in a financial vice so tight he would not be able to breathe. I hung up the phone and opened a direct portal to my primary wealth management firm. The law could put them in prison eventually, but I could bankrupt them today. I examined the corporate structure of the shell company Gideon was using to acquire the scrap steel. He had financed the bulk purchase through a series of high-interest corporate bonds, expecting to retire them once the tower's initial residential units were pre-sold. He was dangerously over-leveraged, standing on a very thin wire of debt. I reached for my keyboard. I was going to buy that wire. And then I was going to cut it. Federal investigations take time. Beckett had promised a swift raid on the strength of what I had provided, but I knew exactly how the justice system operated during the holiday season. Judges were on vacation. Warrants required multiple layers of bureaucratic sign-off. The gears of justice ground forward at an agonizingly slow pace. A man like Gideon did not build a fraudulent empire by being slow or careless. The moment he caught even a whisper of a federal inquiry, he would initiate his contingency protocols. Men of his caliber always had an escape hatch ready for the day their lies finally caught up with them. I knew he would wire the stolen funds to offshore accounts, sitting completely beyond the reach of American jurisdiction. He would liquidate every domestic holding pack, those tailored suits of his, and climb aboard a private charter to some country with no extradition agreement on the books. Most disgustingly of all, he would leave Dylan behind without a second thought to absorb the full weight of a federal indictment. Dylan was arrogant and greedy, yes, but he was also breathtakingly naive. He was the ideal fall guy for a man who had been committing crimes his whole career. If Gideon disappeared, Dylan would spend 20 years inside a federal penitentiary for the structural fraud, and my daughter Lacey would be left with nothing. She would be crushed under the weight of her husband's crimes and the public humiliation that followed. I couldn't allow Gideon to use them as a shield and walk away clean. I needed to build a cage around him that had no door. A legal investigation would freeze his assets eventually, but eventually wasn't good enough. I needed to stop him breathing right now. I needed to cut off his financial oxygen before he even sensed he was running out of air. I picked up my phone and dialed the direct line to my primary wealth management firm in Atlanta. The man who picked up was Gerard, a senior portfolio director who had quietly steered my patent royalties for more than 2 decades. Gerard was one of the only people alive who understood the true scale of my liquid capital. For years, the instructions I gave him had been simple and deeply conservative. Reinvest the dividends. Keep a low-risk profile. Keep my name completely out of any public record. When he heard my voice that evening, he greeted me with his customary measured calm, no doubt expecting another routine question about municipal bonds or tax shelters. I told Gerard we were overhauling our entire strategy effective immediately. I instructed him to establish an anonymous blind trust under a generic corporate name. I made clear I needed absolute secrecy and fast execution. Gerard's tone shifted from relaxed to sharply focused. He understood I had never come to him with a demand like this. I transmitted the corporate identification numbers for Summit Core Fabrication, the phantom company Gideon was running to import the scrap steel. I told Gerard I wanted to trace exactly how the initial purchase of those materials had been financed. Shell companies require enormous seed capital, and I knew Gideon was far too greedy to fund a fraudulent operation out of his own liquid reserves. It took Gerard and his team of analysts less than an hour to map the entire financial architecture of Gideon's company. What they found was a towering house of cards, built entirely on leveraged debt and breathtaking arrogance. To finance the massive steel importation scheme, Gideon had issued a series of high-yield short-term corporate bonds. He had borrowed millions from a consortium of aggressive private equity lenders, and to secure those loans, he had put up his own personal assets as collateral. He had leveraged his luxury real estate portfolio, his investment accounts, and the very penthouse in uptown Charlotte, North Carolina, where Lacey was at that moment planning her lavish Christmas Eve dinner. Gideon was operating on the dangerous assumption that once the steel arrived at the Apex Tower construction site uptown Charlotte, North Carolina, Dillon would blindly authorize the massive construction draw from the project's primary investors. Gideon would then use that incoming capital to retire the high-interest bonds, pocketing tens of millions in pure illicit profit. It was a classic financial float, dependent entirely on perfect timing and absolute deception. But his entire foundation rested on those promissory notes, currently held by the private equity firm. I instructed Gerard to contact the firm immediately. I told him I wanted to buy all of Gideon's debt. Gerard hesitated for only a fraction of a second before setting the heavy financial machinery in motion. In the world of high finance, cash is the absolute king. The private equity lenders holding Gideon's notes were carrying real risk, relying entirely on a construction project reaching completion without delays or inspections catching the fraud. When Gerard offered to purchase the debt outright in cash for an 8% premium above the current market value, the lenders didn't ask a single question. They saw a rare chance to lock in a massive guaranteed profit and shed every ounce of associated risk. The transfer agreements were drafted within the hour. Seated in my quiet, softly lit study, I watched the transactions process across my computer monitors in real time. My hidden wealth, accumulated through decades of honest engineering work and disciplined saving, flowed seamlessly through the encrypted channels of the global banking system. I authorized the movement of millions of dollars from my secure accounts into the newly formed blind trust. From there, those funds moved directly into the private equity firm's holding accounts. In exchange, the digital contracts assigning full ownership of Gideon's corporate bonds populated on my secure server. I read through the fine print of the promissory notes with deep, quiet satisfaction. The stipulations were utterly ruthless, drafted by lenders who wanted absolute dominion over their borrowers. Because Gideon had pledged his personal assets as collateral, the holder of the debt carried the immediate legal right to freeze his accounts and seize his properties the instant those bonds fell into default, or if any fraudulent activity was suspected. Until this precise moment, Gideon believed himself completely untouchable, insulated by his wealth and his formidable social reputation. He had no idea that his entire existence had just been acquired by the very man he had barred from his holiday table. The deep silence of my suburban house outside Charlotte, North Carolina, felt entirely different now. It was no longer the hollow silence of a father left behind by his ambitious daughter. It was the absolute focused silence of a hunter watching a trap close for good. By completing this acquisition, I had effectively become Gideon's supreme creditor. I owned the notes on his Phantom Steel Company. I owned the leverage over his luxury cars. I held the deed to the penthouse where he slept. I controlled the financial lifeblood of his entire corrupt operation. If Beckett's federal agents arrived and Gideon tried to run, he would find his credit cards declined and his bank accounts sealed. If he moved to sell his properties in a hurry to post bail or retain defense attorneys, he would find heavy legal liens locked against every square inch of his real estate. He was financially paralyzed, pinned beneath the crushing weight of his own staggering greed. He had built his empire by exploiting people and shaving corners, but he had never calculated the risk of crossing a structural engineer who understood precisely which support beams to remove to bring the whole structure down. I leaned back in my chair and pulled off my reading glasses, pressing my fingers against the bridge of my tired nose. Outside my window, a light snow had started to fall, laying a clean white coat over the quiet suburban streets. The neighborhood was deep in sleep, dreaming of peaceful holiday mornings and warm family tables. Inside my study, the glow of the monitors lit up a perfectly completed puzzle. The physical evidence of the structural fraud was secured in the hands of the federal prosecutor. The financial chains binding Gideon to his crimes were locked firmly in my possession. My daughter had uninvited me because I didn't fit the wealthy, powerful image she was so desperately trying to project to her new social circle. She had made an active choice to bind herself to a man who dealt exclusively in illusion manipulation and theft. Tomorrow evening, when the clock struck midnight and federal authorities swept into their pristine, perfect celebration, they would finally grasp the true devastating cost of that arrogance. They had walked a catastrophe straight through their own front door. And thanks to my quiet work in the dark, they had nowhere left to go. The digital ink on the transfer agreements assigning Gideon's debts to my private trust had barely dried when my phone buzzed against the mahogany surface of my desk. The sudden vibration shattered the focused quiet of my study. I glanced at the glowing screen. The caller ID showed Lacey's name. For one brief, foolish instant, a deeply buried part of my heart, the father in me, allowed itself to hope she was calling to apologize. I thought maybe the quiet spirit of the season had finally found a crack in the thick wall of entitlement she had built around herself. I was completely wrong. It wasn't a phone call at all. It was a relentless barrage of text messages and high-resolution photographs. The first image was a wide panoramic shot of Gideon's penthouse in uptown Charlotte, North Carolina. Massive floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping, arrogant view of the glittering city skyline. Wrought iron pendant lights hung over a sprawling dining table draped in deep ivory linen and covered in brushed gold platters. The second photograph showed Gideon himself wearing a custom silk dinner jacket, pouring an absurdly expensive aged bourbon into a gleaming row of crystal tumblers. But it was the third photograph that carried the true venomous intent of the message. It was a picture of Dylan. He was standing in an underground climate-controlled parking garage. He was leaning casually against the hood of a brand-new midnight blue German sports car. A massive gold satin bow sat on the roof of the vehicle. The text beneath the photo read, "Gideon really knows how to treat his true family." He just surprised Dylan with an early Christmas bonus for all his hard work on the Apex Tower construction site, uptown Charlotte, North Carolina, uptown Charlotte, North Carolina. "We thought about sending a car to pick you up, but Gideon said you would just feel totally out of place around his corporate partners. Wish you could be here to see all of this. It is going to be a perfect night." She was not sharing her joy. She was deliberately weaponizing her luxury. She wanted me to feel small. She wanted me to sit in my quiet, modest home outside Charlotte, North Carolina, and drown in the bitter realization that I had been completely replaced by a man who could casually hand out sports cars without a second thought. She wanted me to feel the crushing weight of my supposed failure as a father and a provider. She wanted me to understand that my empty chair at their table was not a loss to them, it was a massive upgrade. 10 years ago, a message like that would have shattered me completely. I would have called her back, my voice thick with hurt and betrayal, demanding to know why she was deliberately twisting the knife. I would have handed her exactly the emotional reaction she was hunting for. But tonight I was not a discarded father drowning in self-pity. I was the architect of their coming destruction. I stared at the glowing screen and felt nothing whatsoever except a cold, calculating clarity. If they wanted to play games with imagery and perception, I would give them precisely the illusion they were after. I typed my reply slowly, making certain every word landed perfectly neutral and entirely stripped of a conflict. No anger, no mention of Dylan or Gideon or the car. I simply wrote, "Merry Christmas to you all. Have a beautiful and safe evening." I pressed send. That brief, courteous message was the ultimate smokescreen. By refusing to engage in her petty psychological warfare, by offering a passive and placid blessing instead, I handed Lacey the absolute confirmation of her superiority. In her mind, my bland reply was a white flag, the full surrender of an irrelevant old man who had finally accepted his sorry place at the bottom of the social order. My refusal to push back inflated their collective arrogance to a dangerous, blinding level. They believed they were untouchable. They believed they had won the holiday, won the family, and won the future. And because of that blinding arrogance, they dropped their guard entirely. They were so consumed with gloating over their stolen wealth that they never stopped to consider what they had just placed in my hands. I transferred the high-resolution photographs from my phone directly to my secure desktop server. I opened the sophisticated image analysis software I regularly used to examine microscopic structural stress fractures in steel beams. I was not looking at the expensive aged bourbon or the ridiculous gold bow on the sports car. I was looking at the background data. Lacey had unwittingly delivered the exact tactical intelligence the federal authorities desperately needed. Federal raids on ultra-luxury high-rises are notoriously hard to execute cleanly. The buildings have private security forces, separate elevator banks, and reinforced steel doors. To catch a man like Gideon before he could wipe digital evidence or slip away to a private helipad, the authorities needed to know his precise location and schedule. I zoomed in on the first photograph of Gideon's penthouse in uptown Charlotte, North Carolina. In the reflection off the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could clearly read the illuminated numbers on the digital thermostat and the private security control panel mounted on the far wall. It gave me the exact floor and suite number of Gideon's residence, a detail fiercely guarded by the building's exclusive concierge service. I moved to the second photograph. Behind Gideon's smug face resting on a marble kitchen island was a printed itinerary from the private catering company. I magnified the image, sharpened the text, and boosted the contrast. The schedule laid out the entire flow of the evening. Appetizers at 8, dinner at 10:00. The main holiday toast and family gift exchange exactly at midnight. I completed my analysis by zooming in on the photo of Dylan in the garage. The parking space number was painted in bright yellow on the concrete pillar directly behind the new sports car, an assigned private spot. Now the federal agents wouldn't have to burn precious time combing through the massive subterranean complex for Dylan's vehicles. They could secure his assets the very moment they breached the building perimeter. Lacey had tried to send me a mocking postcard of her glamorous new life. Instead, she had hand-delivered a thorough, detailed tactical map of a criminal sanctuary. I picked up my phone and called Beckett. He answered immediately, the chaotic noise of his office in the background, signaling that his federal task force was already grinding through the holiday evening. "I have the final coordinates," I told him, keeping my voice low and steady. "Gideon is hosting the main celebration at his private residence, Suite 7400. They're running a strict catered schedule. The entire group, including Dylan, will be assembled in the main dining hall for a champagne toast exactly at midnight. The primary suspect vehicles are located in the sub-level 3 secure garage spaces 41 through 45. I heard Beckett typing rapidly on his end of the line. The precision of the information was exactly what his strike team needed. "That is brilliant work, Warren," Beckett said, the sharp edge of anticipation unmistakable in his voice. "We were trying to quietly pull the floor plans from building management without alerting Gideon's private security detail. You just handed us the keys to the castle. The arrest warrants have been signed by the federal magistrate. We are moving in tonight. We will breach the penthouse right as they raise their glasses." I thanked Beckett and ended the call. The bronze face of the mantel clock on my living room shelf chimed, marking the passage of another hour. Outside, the winter night had gone completely dark. The city was settling into a quiet, festive calm, entirely unaware of the massive financial and legal earthquake that was about to tear through it. I walked into my small kitchen and poured myself a large ceramic mug of dark black coffee. I did not need aged bourbon or a penthouse view to feel victorious. I had already forged the chains that would permanently bind them, and my own daughter had cheerfully supplied the locks. The smokescreen was fully deployed and working without a flaw. They were standing at the very peak of their fraudulent empire right now, raising glasses to their stolen wealth and their unassailable power. They had no idea that the foundation beneath their feet had already been completely demolished. All that remained was the spectacular fall. The digital clock on the wall of the federal building in Charlotte, North Carolina read 8 in the evening. Outside the reinforced glass windows, the city was a sprawling canvas of holiday lights and festive color. Families were gathered around roaring fireplaces, exchanging gifts, sharing warm meals. Miles away in a penthouse floating above the skyline, my daughter was likely clinking crystal glasses with the men who had judged me entirely unworthy of their company. Inside the windowless conference room where I sat, the atmosphere was brutally sterile. The air carried the smell of stale coffee, industrial floor cleaner, and the sharp, metallic bite of impending justice. I sat at one end of the long mahogany table. Beckett sat across from me, sleeves rolled up, tie loosened. The holiday season did not exist inside this room. Beside Beckett sat a man named Leonard Hamill. Leonard was a veteran investigative journalist for a major national network. 2 decades back, a high school gymnasium roof had collapsed due to corner cutting by a corrupt municipal contractor. I had given Leonard the anonymous structural analysis he needed to put that contractor away for a very long time. We hadn't spoken since, but when I called him earlier that afternoon and told him I had a corporate massacre ready to be unboxed, he walked away from his own family dinner without a moment's hesitation. I set my heavy leather briefcase on the table. The sharp click of the brass locks rang out in the quiet room. I drew out 3 thick, meticulously organized dossiers and slid them across the polished wood. Beckett took the red folder. Leonard took the black one. I kept the master file in front of me. I skipped the pleasantries and dramatic preamble entirely. I told them to open to the first page. I watched Leonard adjust his reading glasses as he studied the side-by-side structural blueprints. I walked them through the mechanics of the Apex Tower construction site, Uptown Charlotte, North Carolina, Uptown Charlotte, North Carolina. I detailed the specific yield strength required for a 60-story residential building to withstand lateral wind forces and seismic shifts. Then I pointed to the materials manifest Dylan had carelessly left on my front porch. I broke down the chemical composition of the scrap steel Gideon was importing through his shell company Summit Core Fabrication. I showed them the math. I explained that the substandard alloy would absolutely buckle under the sheer vertical load of the upper floor luxury amenities. They were building a vertical graveyard. Beckett turned to the financial section of his dossier. I had given him the complete traceable trail of the embezzled funds. He followed the flow of millions of dollars moving from the initial construction loans through the phantom supplier accounts, and finally into the offshore trusts that Dylan and Gideon controlled. He could see the exact profit margins they were illegally skimming off the top. Beckett leaned back in his chair and rubbed his jaw. He had spent his whole career going after white-collar criminals, but the sheer audacity of this particular operation left him briefly speechless. They were siphoning 40% of the entire structural budget. Then I directed their attention to the dossier's final section. I laid out the original patent schematics for the seismic damping joints and placed Dylan's stolen architectural designs directly alongside them. I made clear that I was the sole legal owner of that specific technology. Dylan had reproduced my proprietary blueprints line by line, convinced that my superior engineering would somehow miraculously paper over the brittle, cheap steel his father-in-law was supplying. He had committed sweeping intellectual property theft to carry out what amounted to a mass casualty crime, and then he had handed the evidence straight to the patent holder, because he figured I was just a worn-out old man who could proofread his documents. Leonard looked up from the papers. The journalist in him grasped the magnitude of the story without needing a moment to think. This was not some local corruption story. This was a national catastrophe intercepted just before it unfolded. He asked me why I had held this back until Christmas Eve. He wanted to understand why I hadn't taken it to the authorities weeks earlier when I first noticed the anomaly. I told him the truth. I explained that I had only subjected the blueprints to serious scrutiny after my daughter barred me from her holiday gathering to protect her husband's fragile corporate image. But more to the point, I walked him through the construction schedule. According to the internal timelines, Dylan had slated the massive concrete pour for the central elevator core of the Apex Tower construction site. Uptown Charlotte, North Carolina, Uptown Charlotte, North Carolina, for the 26th of December. They were racing through the foundation work over the holiday weekend specifically to stay ahead of municipal inspectors. Once that substandard scrap steel was sealed inside thousands of tons of concrete, the physical evidence of their fraud would be buried for good. Any attempt to prove the crime afterward would mean tearing the entire building apart, a legal fight that Gideon would drag through the courts for a decade. We had a window of less than 36 hours to stop them. Beckett grasped the urgency immediately. The holiday created an enormous bureaucratic obstacle. Federal courts were dark. Warrants under normal conditions required days of deliberate review. But the imminent destruction of evidence and the direct, undeniable threat to public safety gave Beckett the legal grounds he needed to go around standard channels. He pulled out his secured federal mobile phone and called a magistrate judge directly at the judge's private residence. I sat without speaking as Beckett paced the full length of the federal building, Conference Room, Charlotte, North Carolina. He spoke in rapid clipped bursts, laying out the embezzlement, the patent theft, and the lethal structural downgrade. He transmitted digital scans of the dossier directly to the judge's secure federal terminal. He made the point that the primary suspects were presently assembled in one location, toasting their new wealth, and that any delay would give them time to move the remaining stolen funds beyond international reach. The tension in that room was absolute. Leonard began drafting his broadcast notes across a yellow legal pad, his pen cutting across the page in furious strokes. He was preparing to break into the scheduled network programming. He was going to expose Gideon and Dylan to the entire country, making certain that no volume of wealth or political leverage could shield them from the public fallout. Leonard asked whether I was ready for the media storm that would inevitably engulf my family. I told him I had already cut those ties. My loyalty was owed to the innocent lives that would have been lost inside that tower, not to the greedy people who happened to share my last name. Beckett ended the call and turned back to face the table. His expression was grim and entirely resolved. The magistrate judge had reviewed the material evidence and recognized the immediate severe threat to human life. The emergency arrest warrants were officially authorized. The signatures were digital, but their authority was absolute. Beckett glanced at his watch. It was closing in on 10:00. He told me his tactical teams were already positioned throughout the city and would begin moving on Gideon's penthouse in uptown Charlotte, North Carolina within the hour. I rose from the heavy oak table and fastened the brass locks on my briefcase. The execution phase of my silent adjustment was finished. The evidence was secured, the warrants were active, and the media broadcast was primed and ready. I had taken the profound contempt my family had shown me and hammered it into an inescapable legal and financial trap. They had wanted a flawless, exclusive holiday entirely removed from my modest existence. They were about to receive an uninvited contingent of heavily armed federal guests instead. I thanked Beckett and Leonard for their swift action. I walked out of the sterile federal building, Conference Room, Charlotte, North Carolina, leaving the federal agents to carry out their work, completely prepared for the midnight shockwave that would permanently demolish my daughter's false empire. The winter air outside the federal building was sharp and unforgiving. But inside the luxury penthouse across the city, the temperature was perfectly controlled. I could picture the scene with total clarity. The bronze face of the mantel clock on my living room shelf began its slow, methodical count toward midnight. At that exact moment, miles away, Gideon would be standing at the head of a vast dining table in a custom silk dinner jacket, pouring an absurdly expensive aged bourbon into a gleaming row of crystal tumblers. Dylan would be seated to his right, wearing the arrogant smirk of a man who believed he had just successfully taken everything he wanted. Lacey would be basking in the warm glow of the wrought iron pendant lights hung over a sprawling dining table draped in deep ivory linen and covered in brushed gold platters, utterly convinced that her curated flawless holiday was the ultimate proof that her life choices had been correct. She had cut away the dead branch of her family tree, and in her mind, the tree was finally free to flourish. They were celebrating a victory built entirely on sand and the tide was already surging in. In the background of their opulent dining room, a large, flat-screen television would be running a holiday concert, providing a polished soundtrack to their elite gathering. Gideon demanded perfection in every detail, and the ambient swell of a symphony orchestra served as ideal auditory wallpaper for his wealth. They were seconds from midnight. They were seconds from raising a toast to their own brilliance. Dylan was likely working up a speech about the tower, bragging about profit margins and the upcoming concrete pour that would lock in their fortune. He had no idea that the pour would never happen. He had no idea that the very blueprints he had carelessly dropped on my porch had already sealed his fate. The bronze face of the mantel clock on my living room shelf struck its 12th and final note. Simultaneously, across the city and across the entire national broadcasting network, the holiday symphony was cut without warning. There was no gentle fade to a commercial break. There was only the harsh, jarring electronic tone of a breaking news alert. The sudden shift in audio would have immediately irritated Gideon. I could picture his heavy sigh of annoyance as he reached for the remote, intending to mute the television and proceed with his grand toast. But before his thumb could find the button, the image on the screen froze him. The bright, festive colors of the holiday concert were replaced by a stark aerial photograph of the Apex Tower construction site, Uptown, Charlotte, North Carolina, Uptown, Charlotte, North Carolina. Bold red graphics flashing across the lower third of the screen read, "Massive federal indictment followed within seconds by Apex Tower executives targeted in fraud sting." The bourbon tumbler in Dylan's hand must have stopped halfway to his lips. The smugness would have drained from his face in seconds, replaced by a cold, suffocating dread. The news anchor, a veteran journalist whose voice carried absolute authority, began reading the breaking bulletin. The anchor detailed the immediate suspension of the Apex Tower construction site, Uptown, Charlotte, North Carolina, Uptown, Charlotte, North Carolina project, in response to a sweeping, coordinated federal investigation into lethal structural fraud. Those words moved through the pristine penthouse, transforming the luxury suite into an echo chamber of impending doom. The broadcast did not traffic in vague accusations. Beckett and Leonard had worked with surgical precision. The anchor laid out the full criminal architecture for the entire nation to hear. The network named Gideon's phantom shell company Summit Core Fabrication. They detailed the specific scheme, explaining how the developers were importing dangerously brittle scrap steel from overseas while billing project investors for high-grade domestic materials. The anchor spelled out the catastrophic implications, stating that the building would have suffered a total structural collapse. Under its own weight had construction continued. Dylan and Gideon were not framed as clever businessmen who had made a minor administrative misstep. They were publicly branded as ruthless criminals who had been actively engineering a mass casualty event for personal gain. Gideon's face would have gone the color of ash. The protective bubble of his enormous wealth popped in an instant. The shell company he believed was untraceable was now the lead story on a national broadcast. The secret offshore accounts he'd used to funnel stolen funds were being dissected openly by legal analysts on live television. Dylan would be scanning the room with wide, panicked eyes, watching his career, his freedom, and everything he'd built dissolve in real time. Lacey would be sitting there motionless in her designer gown, her mind desperately struggling to absorb the sudden violent collapse of the world she'd carefully constructed. But the true shockwave, the absolute psychological devastation, hadn't even landed yet. The news anchor pivoted to the origin of the investigation. She stated that this unprecedented federal raid had only been made possible by the courageous intervention of a key whistleblower. Lacey and Dylan would have expected to hear the name of a rival developer, a bitter former employee, or some highly compensated corporate spy. They expected an adversary drawn from their own cutthroat world of luxury real estate and dark money. What appeared on the screen instead was something else entirely. A high-resolution professional portrait filled the frame. It was a photograph taken of me a decade ago at my induction into the National Academy of Engineering. My gaze was steady. My posture was commanding. The anchor spoke my name, Warren Alcott, but she didn't use the tone of pity or dismissal my daughter had deployed just a few hours before. My name was spoken with genuine reverence. The broadcast didn't introduce me as a struggling retiree occupying an aging suburban house outside Charlotte, North Carolina. It introduced me as a titan of structural engineering. The anchor read my actual credentials aloud. The audience learned that I held the sole patent on the advanced seismic damping technology that kept half the modern skyscrapers in this country from coming down. The segment traced my decades of quiet, flawless work, my substantial contributions to urban safety, and my standing as a fiercely private, self-made billionaire. The anchor went on to describe the developer's ultimate fatal miscalculation. They hadn't only tried to erect a lethal structure built on scrap metal, they had also brazenly lifted proprietary architectural designs to do it. The broadcast made it explicit the developers had handed their fraudulent blueprints directly to the man who owned the very patents they were infringing upon. They had unknowingly delivered their own confession to the architect of their destruction. Inside that penthouse, the silence must have been total, broken only by the sharp crack of a crystal tumbler slipping from someone's fingers and shattering against the hardwood floor. Lacey's mind would have been in full short circuit. The fragile story she'd built to justify cutting me loose was completely destroyed. She had persuaded herself that I was a worthless, irrelevant remnant of the past. She had traded my presence at Christmas for a man who bought cheap sports cars and wore velvet tuxedos. She had stood by while her husband treated me like an unpaid intern. Now, staring at the television, she was forced to confront the appalling truth of what she had actually done. The man she'd discarded was not a failure. He was a giant. The wealth, the power, and the intellect he commanded made Gideon and Dylan look like small-time thieves playing in a sandbox. I hadn't been living in a modest house outside Charlotte, North Carolina because I was broke. I had been living there because I had no need to parade my success in front of anyone. I had kept my fortune out of sight to protect her from the very greed that was now unraveling her life. Dylan would be staring at the screen in pure, undiluted terror. The old man he'd mocked, the man to whom he'd tossed blueprints with a condescending laugh, was the man who had just taken his entire world apart. He understood in that agonizing instant that I had clocked every single flaw, every stolen angle, every falsified figure the moment I unrolled his documents. He had handed a loaded weapon to a master marksman and dared him to squeeze the trigger. Gideon, the arrogant patriarch of this counterfeit family, would be completely frozen. The broadcast made unmistakably clear that the whistleblower had also mapped the financial leverage holding his shell company together. Gideon knew the rules of the game better than most. He knew that once his crimes were public, his creditors would immediately call in his massively over-leveraged debts. He knew that everything he owned, including the penthouse they were all standing in at that moment, was going to be seized. He had constructed his empire on the conviction that he was the sharpest predator in any room. He had just discovered on national television that he was nothing more than prey. The illusion had been shattered completely. The arrogant laughter that had filled Gideon's penthouse in uptown Charlotte, North Carolina just minutes earlier was now replaced by the deafening weight of absolute ruin. They had wanted a holiday free of my depressing presence. I had given them precisely that. I wasn't sitting at their table. I was commanding the airwaves, holding the attention of the entire country, and making certain that their perfect Christmas Eve would be the very last night they ever spent in comfort. As the anchor continued laying out the severe federal charges and the decades of prison time, the executives were facing a new sound began moving through the corridors of the luxury high-rise. Faint, at first muffled by the thick, soundproofed walls, it grew steadily louder, cutting through the shock and panic inside Suite 7400. It was the heavy rhythmic thud of tactical boots advancing down the hallway, paired with the unmistakable sounds of federal agents preparing to breach reinforced doors. The reality I had set in motion had arrived at their doorstep. The pale glow of my monitor washed across the dark study. The anchor kept speaking, her voice measured and professional, mapping the full scale of the fraud I had just exposed. I reached out and pressed the power button on the remote. The screen faded to black. The room fell into complete heavy silence. The deed was done. The mechanism of justice had been triggered, and its gears were already grinding forward with momentum that nothing could stop. I leaned back in my chair and listened to the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. It was exactly 12:14 in the morning. Christmas had officially arrived. Then the silence broke. My phone began vibrating violently against the polished surface of my desk, its harsh mechanical buzz insistent and sharp. I didn't need to look at the screen to know who was calling. The timing was too precise for any other explanation. I let it ring for a few seconds, gathering myself, reinforcing the emotional walls I'd been building for the past several hours. When I finally picked up the device, Lacey's name was flashing in bright letters across the face of it. Only hours ago, she had sent me a message laced with condescension, flaunting her luxury, and dismissing my existence as though it barely registered. I pressed accept and raised the phone to my ear. I didn't say hello. I simply waited. A wall of raw, unfiltered chaos erupted through the speaker. The pristine, curated elegance of Gideon's holiday party had completely evaporated. I heard the shriek of sirens bleeding through what remained of the penthouse windows. I heard the heavy thud of tactical boots hammering against hardwood floors. Over the sirens, the sharp, booming voices of federal agents cut through everything, barking commands with absolute authority. Get on the ground. Keep your hands where I can see them. Do not move. Beneath the roar of the raid, I could make out the sound of a woman hyperventilating rapid, ragged gasps for air, the sound of someone whose entire reality had just caved in on itself. "Dad!" Lacey sobbed. The word came out as a choked, desperate plea. Every trace of arrogance, every layer of practiced superiority she'd wielded against me for years had vanished entirely. She sounded like a frightened child jolted awake from a nightmare. "Dad, what's happening? Why are you on the news?" I kept my voice perfectly level. I didn't allow a single note of satisfaction or vindictiveness into my tone. I spoke with the calm, measured authority of an engineer stating a mathematical certainty. "You are experiencing the consequences of your husband's actions, Lacey." "You know!" She cried out, her voice climbing into a hysterical pitch. "They broke the doors down. Men with rifles just came through Gideon's custom doors. They threw Dylan onto the floor. They're putting handcuffs on him. Dad, you have to help us. They're taking Gideon away. He's screaming at them and they won't listen. Tell me this is a mistake. Tell me you didn't do this." Oh God. I listened to the sound of zip ties ratcheting shut in the background. I heard Dylan's voice, high and thin, protesting that he was a legitimate businessman. The illusion he'd sold my daughter was being dismantled by men in tactical gear carrying federal badges. "It is not a mistake," I said quietly. Dylan and Gideon decided to play God with the lives of hundreds of innocent people. They falsified the structural blueprints for the tower going up in uptown Charlotte, North Carolina. They swapped load-bearing structural steel for cheap, brittle scrap to pocket tens of millions. They erected a towering death trap so they could afford the very penthouse you're standing in right now. "That is not true," Lacey gasped, though the tremor in her voice gave her away. "Dylan would never do something like that. Gideon is a respected developer. So you're just jealous. You're only trying to tear us down because we didn't invite you to dinner." The sheer absurdity of what she said only hardened my conviction. Even as she watched her husband being hauled off by federal agents, she kept clinging to the story that cast me as the villain. She refused to acknowledge that the wealth she worshipped was soaked entirely in corruption. "I'm not jealous of a thief," I replied, my words cutting clean through the noise on the line. "And I did not ruin you." Dylan destroyed himself the moment he decided his profit margin mattered more than human lives. He copied my proprietary seismic designs. He stole my patents to bury his lethal architectural shortcuts. He assumed I was just a broke, useless old man who wouldn't recognize his own life's work. He was wrong. I delivered the unedited blueprints and the offshore shipping manifests straight to the federal prosecutor. I handed them the precise location of Gideon's offshore accounts. The line fell silent for a moment, nothing but my daughter's heavy breathing and the distant shouts of agents locking down the perimeter. I could almost sense the moment the gears finally caught in her mind, the full weight of the truth clicking into place. The broadcast she had just watched on television was no accident. The billionaire whistleblower the news anchor had described with such reverence was her own father. The man she had cut out of her life because he didn't fit her image of wealth was the very man who had just engineered the total collapse of her stolen empire. "You planned this," Lacey whispered, her voice shaking with horror and dawning comprehension. "You knew this was all going to happen tonight. You sent me that text message wishing us a Merry Christmas while you were sitting there dismantling my life. I sent you that message because you needed to believe your illusion was still intact." I answered without hesitation. "You sent me photographs of Gideon pouring expensive champagne. You sent me a picture of Dylan posing with a sports car bought with blood money. You handed the federal agents the precise tactical coordinates they needed to execute a clean raid. You confirmed that every primary target was gathered in one room. I did not destroy your life, Lacey. I simply stopped a massacre." "Please, Dad," she begged, her pride fracturing completely. "Please call them off. You know people. You know the prosecutor. Tell them it was all a misunderstanding. Dylan will return the money. We're going to lose everything. They're freezing the accounts right now. Gideon's lawyers are saying all his assets are locked inside a blind trust. We'll have nothing left. You have to make this right." The desperation in her voice was total. She was begging me to bury a mass casualty crime so she could keep her luxury wardrobe and her standing in high society. She was asking me to hollow out my entire moral foundation to protect two arrogant criminals. A deep, heavy sadness settled into my chest. I grieved the daughter I had once raised, the little girl who had understood the difference between right and wrong. That girl was gone, replaced by a woman who valued a penthouse view over the lives of innocent families. "I cannot fix this, Lacey," I said, my voice dropping to a low, definitive register. "Even if I had the power to halt a federal indictment, I would not use it." Dylan and Gideon had built a house of cards on top of a graveyard. It was always going to come down. I simply made certain it fell on them, rather than on the families who were going to move into that building. "You are a monster," she hissed, her grief curdling into something vicious. "You are my father, and you are letting them take my husband away. I will never forgive you for this. You are dead to me." I took the blow without moving. Her hatred was weightless now. It was the frantic thrashing of something that had just been cut loose from what it fed on. She was striking out because she had no leverage left whatsoever. "You decided who your family was long before tonight," I replied, keeping my voice quiet. "You chose Gideon. You chose Dylan. You chose the illusion of wealth. Now you must live with the truth of how that wealth was built." I listened to the disorder in the background one last time. I heard an agent directing Lacey to step away from the phone and produce her identification. The flawless holiday she had so carefully constructed was nothing but ash. "I am protecting the city from criminals," I said, my last words to the woman who used to be my daughter. "Enjoy your family dinner." I pulled the phone from my ear and pressed the red button, severing the call. The screen went dark. The chaotic noise of the raid dissolved, and my study returned to its deep, undisturbed quiet. I set the phone face down on the mahogany desk. There was no surge of triumph, no cinematic sense of glory. What I felt was the heavy, worn-out stillness of a man who had just performed a necessary and brutal surgery. I had amputated a toxic limb from my life. It was painful, but it was the only way to survive. I crossed to the window and looked out at the falling snow. The city was safe. That tower going up in uptown Charlotte, North Carolina, would never claim a single life. I watched the winter wind move across the neighborhood, smoothing over the old tracks in the street and leaving behind an unmarked surface clean and ready for whatever came next. The sun climbed slowly above the snow-dusted streets outside my cabin outside Charlotte, North Carolina, throwing a sharp, brilliant light across the frost that had settled against the window panes. Inside, the air was warm and carried the faint scent of pine and freshly brewed coffee. It was Christmas morning. For decades, this day had followed the same reliable script: forced smiles, expensive gifts I had no use for, and the suffocating sensation of being an unwanted guest in my own family. Today, the deep quiet inside my kitchen felt like a genuine sanctuary. I sat in my favorite armchair beside the window, watching steam lift off my ceramic mug, a steady and unshakable peace settling into my bones. The digital news feeds on my tablet confirmed the raid had gone exactly as planned. The work on that site in uptown Charlotte, North Carolina was officially dead. Gideon and Dylan were now sitting in separate federal holding cells, denied bail, stripped of their tailored suits and their arrogance. The world was righting itself, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could draw a full breath. The stillness of the holiday morning was shattered by the sound of heavy tires skidding wildly across the icy gravel of my driveway. I looked through the frosted glass and spotted a luxury black sedan, the kind driven by a private chauffeur, slam hard into the snowbank near my front porch. The engine cut out abruptly, followed at once by the frantic sound of car doors thrown open and slammed shut. I didn't move from my chair. I took another slow, deliberate sip of my coffee. Heavy, urgent footsteps hammered up the wooden steps of the porch, and an instant later, my front door was flung wide open without so much as a knock. The freezing winter air rushed into the warm room, carrying with it the two women who had spent the last 10 years making me feel invisible and without worth. It was my daughter, Lacey, and stepping in right behind her was Nadine. Nadine was my former wife. She was a woman who had walked away from our marriage 20 years ago, because she had decided that a structural engineer working to keep municipal buildings standing didn't have the ruthless financial hunger she needed to be satisfied. She had married into a wealthy family of corporate lawyers and had spent her life teaching Lacey to worship those same hollow idols of wealth status and public image. Standing in my doorway on Christmas morning, however, they looked nothing like the untouchable socialites they had always pretended to be. They looked utterly destroyed. Lacey was still in the same designer silk gown from the night before, the expensive fabric badly creased and stained with spilled champagne. Her flawless makeup was smeared in dark streaks across her pale, exhausted face, and she was shaking hard from the cold and the shock. Nadine had thrown a heavy cashmere overcoat over a silk nightgown, her perfectly arranged hair now a tangled, chaotic wreck. They looked like survivors pulled from a shipwreck, washed ashore and stripped bare of every last shred of dignity and pride. There was no greeting, no acknowledgement of the holiday. Lacey pushed into my living room and kicked the front door shut behind her. Her eyes were wide and bright with a manic, unraveling desperation. She started screaming immediately, her voice sharp and frantic inside the quiet cabin outside Charlotte, North Carolina, demanding I pick up the phone and undo the catastrophe I'd set in motion. She ordered me to call the federal prosecutor that very moment and fully recant my whistleblower testimony. She insisted I reach out to the authorities and declare that my structural analysis had been flawed, that I'd made a terrible age-related error in my engineering calculations. She demanded I go straight to the federal courthouse right now, leverage the enormous hidden fortune they now knew I held, and post the millions needed to pull Dylan out of his holding cell. She commanded me to put out a public statement to the business press invoking my storied reputation in structural engineering to vouch for Gideon U.S. Construction Company and halt the catastrophic hemorrhaging of their stock prices. She wanted me to lie to the entire world to shield the men who had plotted to build a vertical graveyard. When I held perfectly still, watching her unravel from the comfort of my armchair, Nadine pushed forward to intensify the assault. Her face had contorted into an ugly mask of pure, concentrated hatred. She leveled a trembling, manicured finger at my chest and unleashed a torrent of bitter, cutting, personal accusations. She screamed that I was a pathetic, envious old man who couldn't stomach watching anyone else rise. She claimed I had engineered this entire federal investigation out of sheer petty spite because I couldn't accept that my daughter was living in luxury I'd never been able to give her. Nadine accused me of being a resentful failure who wanted nothing more than to drag everyone down into my own bleak, solitary suburban existence. She shouted that I had deliberately waited until Christmas Eve to spring this trap, purely to maximize their humiliation. She yelled that I wanted to wreck the most important evening of their lives just to salve my own wounded ego and punish them for leaving me off a dinner invitation list. She screamed that I was a monster, a treacherous, unforgiving father who would rather watch his own family shattered, and his son-in-law marched into federal prison than acknowledge that he was a forgotten old man. I did not raise my voice. I did not rise from my chair to meet their aggression. I did not offer a single word of defense, justification, or apology. The strategy of an emotional manipulator depends entirely on active engagement. They feed on arguments. They draw their power from stoking guilt in their targets, forcing them onto the defensive, making them scramble to explain themselves. I refused to hand them even a drop of that fuel. I sat perfectly still, posture relaxed, breathing slow and steady. I observed their hysteria with the cold, clinical detachment of a scientist watching a volatile chemical reaction from behind thick, protective glass. When my coffee cup was finally empty, I rose calmly from my chair, walked past them as though they didn't exist, and moved into the small kitchen to pour myself a second cup. The sheer ordinariness of the act seemed to push them to the edge of madness. Lacey followed me into the kitchen, her voice cracking as she shifted from aggressive demands to desperate, tearful pleading. She cried that I was destroying her future, that Dylan was a good man who had only made a minor administrative business error, and that I was punishing her for simply wanting a beautiful, successful life. She sobbed openly, sagging against my kitchen counter, begging me to remember that she was my little girl and that a father is supposed to protect his daughter no matter what she's done. Nadine continued hovering in the doorway, hurling vicious insults about my character, my career, and my complete absence of human compassion. The small cabin outside Charlotte, North Carolina rang with their screaming, their weeping, and their relentless barrage of frantic demands. They flooded the room with a chaotic storm of noise, launching every emotional weapon in their arsenal directly at my chest. I let them scream. I let them exhaust their lungs and empty their tear ducts. I let them burn straight through their anger, their panic, and their manipulative, performative grief. I leaned against the kitchen sink, sipping my hot coffee, holding steady, unwavering eye contact with my daughter. And slowly, a terrible realization began washing over them. The minutes passed, and my deep silence grew heavier and more suffocating than all their noise combined. The screaming began to falter, crumbling into jagged, breathless gasps. The frantic pacing came to a complete stop. Lacey wiped her wet face, breath hitching painfully in her throat as she stared back at me. Nadine lowered her pointing finger, the venom dying instantly on her lips. The cabin fell completely, terrifyingly silent, leaving only the sound of the winter wind rattling the window panes. They looked at me, and they finally understood. They saw no conflict whatsoever in my eyes, no hesitation, no residual guilt, no lingering parental weakness left for them to exploit. They realized my silence wasn't the silence of a man cowed by their anger or moved by their dramatic tears. It was the absolute, immovable silence of a judge who had already handed down the final verdict and stepped away from the bench. They finally grasped that every scream, every plea, and every hateful accusation had been bouncing off a wall of solid iron. I had not acted out of jealousy, and I was absolutely not going to rescue them from the consequences of their own monstrous greed. The man standing before them in that kitchen was entirely immune to their existence. The sheer shock of my complete indifference struck them far harder than the federal raid itself. It was the ultimate unbreakable boundary, and it marked their total devastating defeat. The heavy silence in the cabin stretched into an unbearable eternity for the two women standing across from me. I watched the frantic energy drain out of my daughter's posture, entirely replaced by a cold, creeping dread. They had come here expecting a fight. They'd armed themselves with tears, accusations, and shrill demands, fully prepared to hammer at my defenses until I gave way. Instead, they had crashed headlong into a fortress of absolute indifference. Nadine, my former wife, lowered her trembling hand. The venomous words she had readied died in her throat as she looked into my eyes and found absolutely nothing she could use. Lacey sagged against the edge of the kitchen counter, her breath hitching in a series of quiet, ragged gasps. The reality of their complete powerlessness was settling over them like a heavy winter frost. When I was satisfied that their hysterical performance had fully run its course, I turned my back on them. I walked slowly across the rustic wooden floor of my living room toward the heavy oak desk positioned beneath the large bay window. I did not say a single word. The only sound in the room was the soft crackle of logs burning in the stone fireplace and the measured tread of my boots across the floor. I reached into the bottom drawer of the desk and pulled out a heavy, canvas-bound document binder. It was substantial, weighted down by decades of careful planning, meticulous saving, and ultimate leverage. I carried it back to the center of the room and set it down on the solid wood coffee table. The heavy thud made Lacey flinch. I gestured toward the binder, inviting them to look. For a long moment, neither woman moved. They simply stared at it, as though it were a dormant explosive. Finally, curiosity and desperation overcame Nadine's paralysis. She stepped forward, her expensive, heavy cashmere overcoat rustling softly in the quiet cabin, and opened the cover. I watched her eyes move across the first page. I watched her pupils dilate as her mind fought to process the figures printed on the crisp white bank statements. I had laid out a comprehensive summary of my liquid assets, my diversified investment portfolios, and the substantial untaxable royalties generated by my global engineering patents. The numbers on those pages were staggering. They utterly dwarfed the flashy, heavily leveraged wealth that Gideon and Dylan so desperately paraded before the world. Nadine turned the page, her hands beginning to shake. She saw the establishment of blind trusts, the acquisition of prime commercial real estate, and the enormous reserves of capital I had quietly built up over the past 30 years. You are looking at the reality you always claimed I lacked. I told Nadine, my voice calm and perfectly steady. You walked out on me 2 decades ago because you believed my dedication to structural integrity and public safety was a mark of pathetic weakness. You wanted a man who would shout his ambitions from the rooftops, a man who would bury you in visible luxury. You convinced yourself and convinced our daughter that I was a failure because I refused to play that hollow game. Nadine looked up from the documents, her face entirely drained of color. Her lips parted, but she could not form a single coherent word. What comes next is the moment everything I had been carrying in silence finally lands. And the people who thought they understood my world are about to realize they never knew me at all. Before we get there, tell me this. If someone you loved chose comfort and status over honesty, would you wait for them to find their own way, or would you force the reckoning yourself? The shock of discovering she had abandoned a fortune far greater than the one she currently worshipped had momentarily cut off her ability to speak. I turned my attention to Lacey. She was peering at the documents over her mother's shoulder, eyes wide with a mixture of utter confusion and deep betrayal. I addressed her directly, making sure my tone carried no anger, only the dull, lingering sorrow of a father who had fallen short. I kept this hidden from you on purpose, Lacey, I said, watching the tears gather in her exhausted eyes. After your mother left, I watched her pass the disease of entitlement onto you like an inheritance. I saw you starting to measure people's worth by the labels sewn into their clothes and the zip codes of their addresses. I knew that if you ever became aware of what I actually possessed, you would never push yourself to build anything of your own. You would have become a parasite living off my success while looking down on anyone who had less. I wanted to give you the greatest gift a parent can offer. I wanted to give you the chance to forge your own character, to understand what honest work is truly worth, and to learn that real wealth is measured in integrity, not in appearances. I paused, letting the silence carry the full weight of what I was about to say. That grand experiment was a complete and miserable failure. I watched you choose Dylan, a man with no moral compass, simply because he could project the shallow illusion of prestige. I watched you methodically erase me from your life because my quiet, honest existence was an embarrassment to your new social circle. You traded your soul for a seat at a table bankrolled by stolen money and lethal structural fraud. Lacey let out a sharp, painful sob. "You lied to me!" she cried, her voice breaking under the weight of what she was finally grasping. "You let me believe we were struggling. You let me worry about you. I did not lie," I corrected her evenly. "I simply lived modestly. You decided I was a failure because you had adopted a corrupt definition of success, and that definition led you straight into the company of criminals." Nadine suddenly found her voice. Her shock converted almost instantly into frantic, hungry calculation. She slammed her hand down on the open binder. "If you have all of this money," she demanded, her voice shrill and urgent, "then you can fix this. You can retain the best defense attorneys in the country. You can cover Dylan's bail. You can use your influence to settle the federal charges against Gideon's company before they lose everything." I looked at my former wife and marveled at the sheer, unvarnished depth of her moral bankruptcy. Even now, staring at the evidence of a mass casualty crime, stopped at the very last moment, her only instinct was to protect her daughter's husband's financial standing. She had no thought for the innocent lives that would have been lost in that tower going up in uptown Charlotte, North Carolina. She cared only about the money. I stepped forward and rested my hand on the canvas-bound document binder. I turned the heavy pages slowly past the bank statements, past the patent royalties, past the investment summaries. I stopped at the final section of the ledger. I spread a set of dense legal contracts and promissory notes across the table, sliding them directly toward Lacey. "I am not going to save Dylan, and I am certainly not going to save Gideon," I told them, my voice carrying the weight of absolute final authority. "You came here demanding I use my reputation to shield Gideon's company. You demanded I spend my money to preserve the luxury life you believe you are owed. But you have fundamentally misread the situation you are standing in." I pointed to the top document on the table. Lacey leaned in, her eyes moving across the dense legal text. She saw Gideon's signature at the bottom of the page. She saw the corporate designation of Summit Core Fabrication. To finance the massive importation of fraudulent scrap steel, Gideon needed enormous sums of short-term capital. I explained, laying out the mechanics of their ruin with clinical precision. He issued high-yield corporate bonds to aggressive private equity lenders. To secure those loans, he put up every personal and corporate asset he owned. He pledged the company accounts. He pledged the luxury vehicles. He pledged the deed to the very penthouse where you were drinking champagne last night. Lacey slowly lifted her eyes from the document, her breathing shallow and fast. Her mind was finally connecting the last devastating links in the chain I had constructed. "Yesterday evening, while you were sending me photographs to mock my absence from your beautiful life, I contacted my wealth management firm." I continued, my gaze locking onto my daughter's terrified eyes. "I instructed them to establish an anonymous blind trust. Through that trust, I purchased every single cent of Gideon's debt. I bought the promissory notes in cash at a premium directly from his lenders." Nadine stumbled backward, her hand flying to her mouth as the full, inescapable scale of the wreckage became clear. "The federal government is going to prosecute Dylan and Gideon for fraud, embezzlement, and reckless endangerment," I stated, delivering the final crushing blow. "The justice system will strip away their freedom, but I hold the paper on their entire existence." The moment the federal raid began, Gideon's bonds fell into immediate default. As his primary creditor, I have already exercised my legal right to seize the collateral. I own the corporate accounts you believed would rescue you. I own the sports car Dylan was showing off in the garage. I hold the deed to Gideon's penthouse in uptown Charlotte, North Carolina. The wealth you are so immensely proud of, the luxury you used to justify cutting me out of your lives, belongs entirely to me. Lacey sank into the armchair I had vacated earlier. The fight left her completely replaced by a hollow, resounding despair. She buried her face in her hands and began to weep the deep, mournful sounds of someone watching the whole of their world reduced to ash by their own hand. Nadine stood frozen beside the coffee table, her eyes sweeping desperately around the modest cabin as though the walls were closing in. "There is nothing left to demand and nothing left to negotiate," I said, closing the heavy canvas binder with a firm, resounding snap. "You built your entire identity on the illusion of superiority and stolen wealth. That illusion is finished." I turned away from their weeping and moved toward the front door. I pulled it open, letting the bitter, freezing winter air sweep through the warmth of the cabin once more. I looked back at the two women who had brought nothing into my home but cruelty and vanity. "The door is open," I told them, my voice stripped of any remaining feeling. "It is time to leave. There is a very long, very difficult reality waiting for you out there." Lacey rose slowly from the chair, her body trembling with a bone-deep exhaustion. She did not look at me. She simply gathered her ruined designer coat tightly around her shoulders and walked out into the freezing snow. Nadine followed just behind her head, bowed in complete, wordless defeat. I watched them make their way down the icy driveway toward their car, a vehicle they no longer truly owned, stepping out into a world where their names now stood not for power, but for public disgrace. I pulled the heavy wooden door shut behind them, turned the lock with a solid, satisfying click, and returned to the still warm quiet of my Christmas morning. The equation of my life was finally balanced. The heavy canvas-bound document binder sat on the coffee table like a headstone marking the absolute death of their arrogance. The crushing weight of my financial dominion had paralyzed them, entirely peeling away the last remaining fibers of their manufactured superiority. The shift in their demeanor had been immediate and pitiful to observe. The ferocious anger that had carried them through my front door dissolved into nothing, replaced at once by the suffocating panic of a predator that finds itself snapped inside a steel trap. They had come here to bully a discarded old man into submission. Instead, they had walked into a fortress of wealth and power that lay entirely beyond their comprehension. Lacey was the first to change course. The shrieking, aggressive socialite disappeared, and in her place, she summoned the desperate, weeping ghost of the little girl I had once raised. She sank to the floor, her ruined designer gown spreading around her knees, and crawled forward until her shaking hands closed around the fabric of my trousers. She looked up at me through a heavy veil of smeared mascara and genuine terrified tears. Her voice dropped a full octave, softening into a fragile, trembling whisper engineered to trigger a father's protective instincts. She pleaded with me to remember the past. She reached back 20 years, calling up memories of how I used to carry her on my shoulders, how I'd sworn I would always shield her from the monsters under her bed. She begged me to see her not as the woman who had orchestrated her husband's downfall, but as her daddy. She cried that Dylan was sitting in a freezing concrete holding cell surrounded by hardened criminals. She sobbed that the federal agents had locked down every personal account they owned, leaving her with nothing but the clothes on her back. She begged me to open that heavy canvas-bound document binder and wire just a fraction of my hidden wealth to cover Dylan's bail. She promised that if I simply wrote the check, she would walk away from the divorce and out of my life. She swore she'd bring Dylan to me on his knees to apologize, and that we could finally be a real family again. She was offering to sell her loyalty back to me in exchange for her husband's freedom. Nadine immediately joined the chorus of pathetic submission. The woman who had spent 2 decades treating my very existence as a humiliating joke now moved forward with her hands pressed together in desperate supplication. The expensive heavy cashmere overcoat slipped from her shoulders and landed in an undignified heap on the rustic floorboards. She abandoned her haughty aristocratic bearing entirely. She begged me to show mercy, invoking our shared history and the vows we had once made. She pleaded that a scandal of this scale would utterly destroy her new family's standing in the city. She implored me to consider the public shame, the media circus, and the complete ruin of the social position she had spent her entire life carefully constructing. She told me I had made my point, that I had won, and that I could now step in graciously to save them all. I stood perfectly still, looking down at the two women weeping on my living room floor. I didn't interrupt their frantic apologies or their desperate bargains. I let them fully empty themselves, their words echoing and fading against the solid wooden walls of my cabin outside Charlotte, North Carolina. I watched their tears with cold, clinical detachment. They were crying, but every tear was entirely selfish. They were not weeping out of remorse for the monstrous crimes Dylan and Gideon had committed. They were not shedding a single tear for the innocent families who would have been crushed to death inside the Apex Tower construction site, uptown Charlotte, North Carolina, uptown Charlotte, North Carolina. They were crying exclusively for themselves, mourning the sudden death of their luxury, the loss of their status, and the evaporation of their unlimited credit. When their sobs finally broke down into exhausted, ragged gasps, I took a deliberate step backward, forcing Lacey to release her grip on my clothing. That physical separation mirrored the absolute emotional severance I had already carried out in my heart. "I am not going to write a check," I said, my voice moving through the quiet room with a terrifying, immovable calm. "I will not authorize a single cent from those accounts to post bail for your husband. I will not make a single call to the federal prosecutor on his behalf. Dylan and Gideon are going to remain exactly where they are, and they are going to face the absolute maximum penalty the justice system can deliver." Lacey let out a sharp, breathless wail, clutching her chest, as though I had physically struck her. Nadine stared at me in wide-eyed horror, unable to process the reality that her emotional manipulation had failed so completely. "You came into my home this morning and accused me of acting out of petty jealousy." I continued, addressing Nadine directly, my tone stripped of any lingering warmth. "You accused me of engineering this entire federal raid simply because I was bitter about being left off a holiday dinner invitation. You genuinely believed my ego was so fragile and my world so small that I would bring down a corporation just to punish you for a social slight. You measure every action by how it affects your personal standing, and you project that shallow, hollow morality onto everyone around you." I shifted my gaze downward, locking eyes with my weeping daughter. "I did not dismantle Gideon's empire because my feelings were hurt, Lacey," I said, pressing each word out with heavy, deliberate weight. "I dismantled it because your husband and your father-in-law are mass murderers who simply hadn't finished building their weapon yet." Lacey shook her head frantically in denial, but I refused to let her look away. "They deliberately altered the chemical composition of the structural steel intended for a 60-story residential high-rise," I told her, forcing her to confront the brutal, ugly truth behind her wealth. "They swapped critical load-bearing materials for cheap, brittle scrap metal that would have buckled completely under the weight of the upper floors. They embezzled tens of millions of dollars from the construction budget, and they stole my proprietary engineering patents to create a fraudulent veneer of safety. They knew exactly what they were doing. They knew the building would eventually collapse. They were entirely willing to bury hundreds of innocent men, women, and children under thousands of tons of concrete and twisted steel so they could afford the sports cars, the custom silk dinner jackets, and the brushed gold platters you were bragging about last night." The full horror of that reality finally broke through the thick walls of Lacey's denial. She stopped shaking her head. The color drained from her face, leaving her looking hollow and entirely broken. She was finally understanding that her perfect life had been funded by the promise of a massacre. "You came here begging me to save your family," I said, my voice dropping to a low, sorrowful register. But the truth is my family died a long time ago. The little girl I carried on my shoulders would have been horrified by a man who trades human lives for profit. The woman kneeling on my floor right now is a complete stranger to me. You chose to blind yourself to their corruption because that corruption paid for your lifestyle. You chose your path, Lacey. Now you have to walk it all the way to the end. I raised my arm and pointed a steady, unwavering finger at the front door of my cabin outside Charlotte, North Carolina. Get out of my house, I commanded, stripping away the very last trace of fatherly warmth I had left. I have nothing left to give you. Do not call me again. Do not come here again. So you are entirely on your own. Nadine scrambled backward, snatching her fallen heavy cashmere overcoat up from the floor. She didn't say another word. The sheer force of my absolute rejection had reduced her to silence. She moved quickly toward the door, her hands trembling so badly she could barely turn the handle. Lacey stayed on the floor a moment longer, looking up at me with eyes that finally recognized the permanent, unbridgeable gap I had placed between us. The manipulative hold she had used to steer my emotions for years had been severed cleanly and for good. She slowly pushed herself up from the wooden floorboards, shoulders slumped in total defeat. She turned and followed her mother out into the freezing, brilliant morning light, stepping from the warmth of my sanctuary into the devastating, cold reality of her new life. I walked to the heavy wooden door and pulled it shut, listening to the solid, permanent click of the deadbolt locking into place. Outside, the engine of their luxury sedan roared to life, its tires spinning against the ice as they retreated toward the city to face their ruin. Inside my cabin outside Charlotte, North Carolina, a deep and peaceful silence settled back in, wrapping around me like a heavy winter blanket. I returned to my armchair by the window, picked up my ceramic mug, and took a long, quiet sip of dark black coffee. The past was finally buried. The debt was fully paid, and I was entirely free. The federal justice system moves with agonizing slowness for the innocent, but for the guilty caught in the glaring spotlight of a national catastrophe. It operates with the terrifying speed of a falling guillotine. Gideon and Dylan had spent their entire careers convinced that the law was merely a suggestion for the poor and a minor inconvenience for the wealthy. They believed their expensive corporate lawyers could drown any accusation in endless paperwork and procedural delays. They were completely unprepared for the overwhelming, suffocating weight of the evidence I had placed in the hands of the authorities. There were no loopholes to exploit and no technicalities to manipulate. The original blueprints, the shipping manifests, the substandard scrap steel, and the direct offshore money transfers were irrefutable. When they were brought before the federal magistrate for their initial arraignment, the arrogance that had defined their entire existence was completely erased. I watched the proceedings through the live television feed from the quiet comfort of my study. Gideon looked significantly older. The custom silk dinner jacket had been replaced by a standard-issue detention uniform. His face, ordinarily flushed with the intoxicating rush of power, had gone gray and hollow. Dylan stood beside him, shaking visibly. The magnetic charm he had always relied on to move through high society galas was worth absolutely nothing inside a sterile courtroom packed with federal prosecutors. The judge read the charges with a cold, mechanical precision that cut through the silence of the room wire fraud, massive embezzlement, intellectual property, theft, and reckless endangerment of public safety. The prosecution walked the jury through the full timeline of the Apex Tower construction site, uptown Charlotte, North Carolina, laying out in precise detail exactly how close the city had come to a catastrophic mass casualty event. They entered the forged seismic damping patents into evidence. They placed the structural analysis before the jury, demonstrating that the building would have buckled under its own load. When the defense moved for bail, citing Gideon's deep community ties and his record of philanthropic giving, the judge denied the motion on the spot, declaring both men an extreme flight risk and a direct danger to the public. They were remanded to federal custody pending trial. The reality of it landed on them in real time, 30 to 40 years in a federal penitentiary. Their lives as free, powerful men were over permanently. Whatever days remained would be spent surrounded by concrete and steel that offered them no angle and no exit. The unraveling of their corporate empire set off an immediate and devastating chain reaction that consumed my former wife entirely. Nadine had spent the better part of 2 decades carefully cultivating an image of aristocratic invulnerability. She had walked away from our modest life because she needed a grander stage, and she was certain she had locked in her place at the very top of the social order. She believed she was fully insulated from the fallout of Gideon's business practices. She was completely wrong. Gideon had built his entire fortune on a towering scaffold of leveraged debt. To fund the importation of the fraudulent steel and sustain the illusion of limitless liquidity, he had pledged every personal asset he owned as collateral. When federal authorities froze the corporate accounts, the massive private equity loans defaulted at once. As the supreme creditor, having quietly acquired those specific promissory notes, I authorized the immediate foreclosure on the collateral properties. Bank representatives and federal marshals arrived at Nadine's luxury estate in Myers Park, Charlotte, North Carolina, early on a Tuesday morning. The estate was a monument to her vanity-manicured gardens, towering iron gates, and an endless procession of imported marble. My legal team sent me the full account of the eviction. Nadine had come to the door in a state of imperious, high-handed outrage, demanding to know why armed men were standing on her immaculate driveway. She threatened to call the police. She threatened to end the career of every last person on that porch. She swung her social status like a weapon, completely blind to the fact that the gun in her hand held nothing. The lead federal marshal pressed the foreclosure notice into her palm and told her she had exactly 1 hour to vacate the premises. The reality of that document broke something in her. She screamed that it had to be a mistake, that the house was hers, that she was a respected member of elite society. But her name was not on the deed, and the money that had paid for those marble floors was sitting in a federal evidence locker. She was left standing on the frozen sidewalk, clutching a single designer handbag, watching as strangers methodically changed the locks on the heavy mahogany doors. The neighbors she had spent years trying to impress gathered on their own manicured lawns and observed her public unraveling with thinly concealed satisfaction. The aristocratic facade she had maintained for 20 years was stripped away in a matter of hours, leaving her exposed as a willing participant in a monumental fraud. She had traded her integrity for a mansion, and now she had nothing at all. While Nadine was being removed from her estate, my daughter Lacey was waking up to a reality far more brutal than anything she had ever prepared herself for. Lacey had spent her entire adult life sealed inside a protective bubble of unlimited capital. She had never once felt the sting of an unpaid bill or the cold dread of a bank balance in freefall. Money was to her an infinite resource, something that materialized on demand to satisfy whatever she wanted. When she left my cabin outside Charlotte, North Carolina on Christmas morning, she was still gripping the delusion that she could somehow salvage her lifestyle. She believed she could pivot, work her connections, and ride out the storm. Her reckoning began at a luxury boutique hotel in uptown Charlotte, North Carolina, After leaving my home, she had checked herself into a luxury suite, intending to wait out the media frenzy and settle on a plan. When she tried to order an expensive breakfast from room service, the concierge politely informed her that her primary credit card had been declined. Irritated and offended, Lacey offered a second card, then a third. Every piece of plastic in her wallet was rejected in turn. The federal government had thrown a wide net over every account tied to Dylan and Gideon, freezing assets pending the criminal investigation. Panic took hold. Lacey reached for her phone and began working through her contacts. These were the wealthy, influential people she had chosen over her own father. These were the women she attended charity galas with, the women who praised her taste and showed up to her lavish parties. She called them one after another, desperate for somewhere to stay, a short-term loan, any fragment of solidarity. Every call went straight to voicemail. In the ruthless surface-level world she had fought so hard to enter, failure was a contagion. Her name was now attached to a national scandal and public endangerment. The socialites she had called her true family excised her from their lives with the exact same cold, calculating efficiency she had used when she abandoned me. By mid-afternoon, hotel management asked her to vacate the suite for non-payment. Lacey found herself out on a busy city street corner, clutching a useless leather wallet, staring at a world she had never once made any effort to understand. The winter wind cut straight through her thin designer coat, offering nothing in the way of warmth or shelter. For the first time in her 30 years of life, she was forced to stare into the absolute void of her own capabilities. She had no practical skills. She had never held a job that wasn't placed in her hands by a wealthy relative. She had no idea how to assemble a resume, navigate a public transit route, or secure a basic apartment lease. Her entire existence had been a polished performance, bankrolled by stolen money and bottomless entitlement. Stripped of the fraudulent wealth that had defined her, she was helpless in every sense that mattered. She walked for hours through the freezing city, the bright glow of storefronts lining her path, like a cold mockery of her sudden poverty. She looked at the ordinary people moving past her on the sidewalk. People she had spent her life looking down upon, and understood with crushing clarity that every single one of them was infinitely better equipped to survive than she was. I sat in the still warmth of my study, working through the finalized legal briefings on the foreclosure and the frozen accounts. A deep, settled quiet had taken hold of the room. There was no joy in watching the total collapse of people I had once called family. There was only the solemn, undeniable satisfaction of a structural equation finally resolving itself. They had raised an elaborate, towering structure using the weakest, most corrupted materials available. They had disregarded the fundamental laws of integrity and relied entirely on deception to keep their lives from falling apart. I had not brought about their destruction. I had simply stepped aside and let gravity do its inevitable work. The empire of lies was reduced to dust, and I remained standing firmly rooted in the quiet, unshakable truth I had lived by my entire life. 6 months had passed since the federal raid dismantled the Summit Core fabrication empire. The heavy winter snow had long since thawed, giving way to the lush green growth of early summer spreading across my property outside Charlotte, North Carolina. I had settled into a deep and quiet rhythm. The media firestorm surrounding the collapse of Gideon's company had reached a fever pitch, yet I remained entirely insulated inside my cabin. I knew exactly where Lacey was. I had not left her to the wolves without keeping a distant, silent watch. She was no longer living in a luxury penthouse above the city skyline. She was renting a small studio at Lacey's studio apartment in the North End Industrial Corridor, Charlotte, North Carolina. To cover her rent, she had taken a job as a retail cashier at a large discount home goods store. For a woman who had spent the last decade directing household staff and swiping platinum credit cards without a second thought, that collision with reality was brutal and absolute. My private investigator sent me periodic reports. He laid out the grinding reality of Lacey's 8-hour shifts standing on bare concrete until her feet went numb. Wrangling irritated customers, hoisting heavy boxes, counting out change until her hands physically ached. She was learning the true price of a single dollar the hard way. She was catching the public bus before dawn because a personal vehicle was now well beyond her means. She was picking up marked-down groceries and figuring out how to stretch a minimum wage check across her electricity and heating bills. The universe was doing what I never could, wringing the arrogance out of her one humbling shift at a time. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon when she finally showed up at my door. I was out on the porch watching the rain move across the garden when a dented 12-year-old hatchback rolled into my driveway. The contrast to the black luxury vehicle she and her mother had buried in a snowbank 6 months earlier was almost violent. The driver's door swung open with a sharp metallic groan. Lacey stepped out into the drizzle. The transformation was total. The expensive silk gowns and the immaculate salon hair were gone without a trace. She had on a faded green uniform polo shirt and dark canvas work pants. Her hair was pulled back in a plain, functional knot. Her face carried no makeup at all, leaving the dark hollows of deep exhaustion fully exposed beneath her eyes. Her hands looked raw and overworked, the manicured nails traded in for chipped polish and small cuts. She looked older, worn down, and entirely beaten. She climbed the wooden porch steps with a slow, reluctant weight in every footfall. She did not push her way in. She stopped at the top of the stairs and looked at me. I did not rise from my chair. I simply waited. "Dad," she said, her voice barely audible against the sound of the falling rain. "Can we talk?" I got up, opened the front door, and waved her inside. The cabin outside Charlotte, North Carolina was warm and dry. I went to the kitchen and filled 2 mugs with black coffee. I handed her one. She took it with both hands, curling her cold fingers around the ceramic as if it were the last source of warmth left anywhere in the world. She perched on the edge of the sofa and stared down at her worn sneakers. She did not ask for money. That was the first telling difference. She did not demand that I sort out her problems or rail against the injustice of how far she had fallen. She drew a slow, unsteady breath and started to talk. She told me about the raw terror of her new life. She described the deep physical toll of standing at a cash register until her lower back felt like it was splitting apart. She talked about the humiliation of ringing up women she used to seat at her charity galas, women who now looked straight past her as though she were part of the store's fixtures, invisible, irrelevant, entirely beneath their notice. Then she moved from the physical to the moral. She raised her eyes to mine, and they were full of real, unguarded remorse. "You were right," she whispered, her voice fracturing under the weight of it. "You were right about Dylan. You were right about Gideon. And you were right about me." She walked me through where the federal trial stood. She had been compelled to sit in that courtroom and listen to prosecutors lay out the cold mathematical inevitability of the Apex Tower collapse. She had watched forged steel manifests and diverted funds projected on large monitors for the public to examine. She had finally come to understand that the magnificent life she believed she had earned was soaked through with the blood of people who had simply been fortunate enough not to die. She now grasped fully that her luxury had been bankrolled by a calculated corporate massacre. I was so blind," she cried, the tears finally breaking free and tracking clean lines down her exhausted face. "I wanted the status so desperately that I looked past every warning sign there was. I treated you like something to be ashamed of because your quiet integrity made me feel the full weight of my own shallowness. I lost everything, Dad. I lost my husband to a federal prison sentence. I lost every one of my high society friends. I lost my beautiful home. But the hardest part is knowing I deserved every single loss." I listened to her empty herself out completely. I did not cut in once. When she finished, I let the quiet sit between us. Let the full mass of her confession settle into the room where it belonged. There was a deep ache in my chest, a father's sorrow for what she was living through, but I also understood the absolute necessity of it. The fire she was walking through right now was the only thing powerful enough to burn away the toxic entitlement that had poisoned her for a decade. "You didn't come here looking for a check," I said, keeping my voice even and measured. "No," she answered quickly, shaking her head to make the point plain. "I don't want your money. I just want to know if you can ever forgive me. I want to know if I still have a father." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee. I leaned forward, forearms on my knees, holding her gaze without looking away. "Forgiveness isn't a magic word, Lacey," I said carefully. "It isn't a switch you throw to make the past disappear. You spent 10 years treating me as something disposable and inconvenient. You cheerfully aligned yourself with men who saw human life as a rounding error on a balance sheet. You can't simply cry, say sorry, and expect the ledger to come clean." She took that without flinching, which was itself a sign that the cash register was doing its work. She was learning to absorb hard truths without crumbling into a scene. I am not going to rescue you. I continued planting the boundary in solid ground. I have the financial resources to buy you a new house, clear your mounting debts, and wrap you in a cushion against every hardship. I will not do it. The moment I hand you a single dollar, I steal from you the education you are currently earning. You are learning to stand on your own. You are learning what an hour of real labor actually costs a human body. You are building genuine character for the first time, and I will not touch that process. She nodded slowly, dragging the back of her worn hand across her wet face. I know, she said, her voice steadying as she pressed the remaining tears back. I know you won't cover my way. I'm working 40 hours a week. I'm paying my own rent on time. I'm eating cheap canned food. It's awful. And I am scared every day that I'm going to fail. But for the first time in my life, I know the ground under my feet is solid. I know that whatever little sits in my bank account was put there by my own effort, not lifted from a construction budget. That was the real turning point. The arrogant parasite that had taken up residence in my daughter's mind was finally dead. In its place, an exhausted but resilient human being was beginning to take shape. I looked at her tired face, her unstyled hair, and the simple green uniform shirt. For the first time in a decade, I actually recognized my child. You have a long and genuinely hard road in front of you, I told her, letting my voice soften just a fraction, enough to let a small measure of warmth back into the room. You are going to have to rebuild your entire life from nothing. You will have to navigate public shame, crushing debt, and the daily grind of bare survival. But you are finally moving in the right direction. I stood and went to the kitchen to collect the glass coffee pot. I came back to the living room and poured a fresh measure of hot, dark coffee into her mug, filling it to the rim. If you need a safe, quiet place to sit on a Sunday afternoon, I said, looking down at her, you are welcome here. If you need someone to hear you out about your aching feet or a miserable store manager, you can call me. I will give you my time, my attention, and my complete honesty. I will never again offer you my wallet. Lacey looked up at me and offered a faint, tentative smile. It was fragile, but it was the most genuine, beautiful smile I had seen on her face since she was a little girl. Thank you, Dad, she whispered, her voice quiet and full of real relief. That is exactly what I need. The early summer morning brought a gentle, cool breeze sweeping through the dense pines surrounding my cabin outside Charlotte, North Carolina. I sat in my favorite rocking chair on the front porch of my cabin outside Charlotte, North Carolina, the weathered wood settling into its familiar, unhurried rhythm beneath me. A large ceramic mug of dark black coffee warmed both hands, its heat seeping into my palms and pushing back the last of the morning's chill. The air carried damp earth, wild blossoms, and fresh pine, a clean, uncomplicated scent that had nothing in common with the sterile, heavily perfumed atmospheres of the luxury towers I had brought down. For the first time in an incredibly long stretch, my mind was completely still. The relentless, gnawing dread that had dogged me for months, the crushing weight of carrying a catastrophic secret, was gone entirely. I drew a long breath of crisp morning air and felt a deep, unshakable calm settle across my whole being. Just beyond the open living room window, my small television murmured at a low volume, quiet enough not to disturb the forest, loud enough to catch the breaking news. Today was a historic day for the city. The screen showed a live aerial feed of the tower. It dominated the downtown skyline like an enormous, glittering testament to corporate greed and moral bankruptcy. From the outside, the glass curtain wall looked pristine, throwing back the morning sun with an arrogant shine. But I knew the reality beneath it. I knew precisely what that polished exterior was hiding. I knew the steel skeleton was weak, brittle, and fundamentally compromised. I knew the entire structure was a lethal trap, a building quietly waiting to come down under its own colossal mass. The news anchor spoke in a solemn, measured tone, walking viewers through the extraordinary federal mandate that had led to this moment. Because Gideon and Dylan had fatally undermined the tower's structural integrity by substituting substandard scrap metal, the city's engineers had concluded that the building was beyond saving. It could not be retrofitted, and it could not be reinforced. The foundation was tainted, the core entirely hollowed out. The only course was complete erasure. I watched the countdown tick across the bottom of the screen. 10, 9, 8. I lifted my mug and took a slow, deliberate sip, feeling the warmth travel down my throat. 3, 2, 1. A rapid sequence of bright flashes burst from the base of the tower, instantly chased by thick gray plumes of dust punching outward from the lower floors. The controlled charges had severed the primary load-bearing columns all at once. For one suspended fraction of a second, that massive skyscraper seemed to hold itself up by willpower alone, and then it simply let go. The tower folded inward and cascaded toward the earth in a breathtaking, terrifying release of kinetic force. Floor after floor pancaking downward, brilliant glass exploding into millions of tiny, irrelevant fragments. A vast, billowing column of pulverized concrete and steel climbed high above the city, swallowing the surrounding blocks whole. The physical destruction of that building was a precise, literal echo of what I had done to the corporate empire and the hollow reality my former family had worshipped. They had tried to raise an immense and imposing structure on a foundation built from lies, theft, and complete moral rot. As a structural engineer, I have understood my entire career that the laws of physics extend no mercy. You cannot cheat a mathematical equation, you cannot bargain with gravity, and you cannot bribe the wind. A building must transfer its load cleanly into the earth. It must carry the tensile strength to absorb extreme pressure and unexpected trauma. Human character runs on the exact same principles. Gideon and Dylan had no moral tensile strength to speak of. When the federal investigation applied its full force to their lives, their brittle and corrupt foundation gave way immediately. A false foundation will always collapse. That outcome is not a possibility. It is a certainty. I had simply initiated the demolition before their structure could claim the lives of people who had done nothing wrong. As the dust clouds began to settle on the screen, I looked inward for any trace of spite or triumphant satisfaction. I found none. I did not feel the petty gloating of a man who had pulled off a personal score. The ruins of their wealth, the seizure of their properties, and the lengthy prison sentence awaiting my former son-in-law were not prizes to display. They were the tragic, necessary outcome of cutting out a malignant growth. What I felt was the quiet, solemn relief of a surgeon who has successfully removed a diseased limb and watched the patient stabilize. The people who would have moved into those luxury condominiums, the maintenance workers who would have walked those corridors. The children who would have slept soundly in their beds would never know my name. They would never know how close they came to a sudden and violent end. That anonymous, invisible protection was the only reward I had ever wanted. My thoughts drifted from the television and came to rest gently on my daughter. 6 months had passed since she walked out of this cabin into the freezing snow, permanently stripped of her unlimited credit cards, her designer wardrobe, and her utterly false sense of superiority. The drop from pampered socialite to struggling retail cashier had been a brutal, grinding ordeal. I knew how agonizing the transition had been. I knew she cried herself to sleep in Lacey's studio apartment in the North End Industrial Corridor, Charlotte, North Carolina, cramped, drafty, and tucked into a forgotten corner of the city. I knew her hands ached from standing at a register and scanning discounted merchandise through 8 grueling hours every single day. I knew the humiliation of her new circumstances burned her pride fresh each morning when she had to board the crowded public bus to a job she once considered beneath her. But sitting there on my porch, hands wrapped around my mug, I felt a deep swell of paternal pride. When she had come to see me last week, wearing her faded green uniform polo shirt looking completely wrung out, I had finally seen the woman I had always believed she could be. She had not come demanding money, and she had not arrived with accusations to hurl. She had come to confess, to apologize, and to ask for honest guidance. She had admitted that the manual work and the terrifying arithmetic of paying her own utility bills had ground her ego down to nothing. She acknowledged that the pain in her feet and the hard reality of a meager paycheck had finally forced her eyes open to the grotesque shape of the life she had lived before. The arrogant, entitled parasite that had inhabited my daughter for 10 years had been completely starved out. In its place, a resilient and honest human being was beginning to take hold. By destroying the fraudulent fortune built around her, I had not ruined her life. I had rescued it. I had forced her to tear away the rotten, hollow framework of her existence and make contact with the solid, unforgiving ground of reality. She was finally learning the true heavy weight of a single dollar earned through honest and agonizing effort. She was learning that human dignity does not come from the luxury label stitched into a handbag or the floor number of a penthouse apartment. It comes from the quiet, unglamorous satisfaction of surviving on your own merit, of paying your own way, without exploiting a single living soul. I had refused to extend her a financial lifeline during that visit. I gave her a hot cup of coffee, a stern listening ear, and the unvarnished truth. I told her she had to rebuild her life entirely from scratch. She was constructing a new existence from absolute zero. But this time the foundation she was laying was entirely real, poured with the concrete of hard work, and reinforced with the unbreakable steel of genuine integrity. She was enduring the stress test of poverty, and she was demonstrating the strength to withstand it. She was finally becoming someone I could deeply respect. Nadine, by contrast, had failed the stress test completely. My former wife was now occupying a cramped, rented room, filling her days, composing bitter, venomous letters to former society friends who paid her no attention whatsoever. She refused to take any personal responsibility for her collapse. She remained locked in a perpetual cycle of victimhood, incapable of grasping that her lifelong worship of money had been the very engine of her destruction. She was trying to build a new life on that same rotten foundation of superficiality, and she would keep collapsing under her own weight. I felt a brief flicker of pity for her, then let the breeze carry it away. Some people simply will not learn the mechanics of a stable structure. I turned my eyes back to the television through the cabin window. The heavy dust had finally cleared over this downtown district, leaving behind a wide, empty crater where the monument to corporate greed had stood. The news anchor was now reporting that the city had already selected a new, highly reputable construction firm to clear the debris and begin rebuilding the site from the ground up. This time, the municipal inspectors would scrutinize every graded piece of steel. This time, the structural engineers would verify that every load-bearing column was perfectly calibrated. This time, the structure would rise solid, tall, and genuinely safe. It would be a building worthy of the name, engineered to endure any punishing storm or seismic force, because every beam and bolt would be placed the right way. A small, quiet smile crossed my face. Pure contentment. Nothing more. I lifted my ceramic mug and took one last unhurried sip of the dark black coffee. All around me, the forest hummed with the simple, beautiful sounds of ordinary life. That is where the story rests. A rocking chair on a quiet porch, a mug of coffee going warm in my hands, and a skyline somewhere across the city with one less lie standing in it. I will not pretend the years between the betrayal and that morning cost me nothing. They cost me nearly everything a father holds dear. I lost a decade of closeness with my daughter. I watched my marriage rot from the inside out. I carried a secret so heavy, it reshaped the way I slept at night. But I believe God does not waste suffering. The Lord's timing is not always comfortable, and it is rarely fast, but looking back, every painful delay was doing something I could not yet see. It was preparing the ground for something true to finally grow. Here is what this story taught me, and what I hope it leaves with you. Do not confuse a person's silence for weakness. The quietest people in the room are often the ones watching most carefully. If you build your life on borrowed status, understand that the lender will eventually come to collect. Build something that belongs to you. When someone shows you who they are through their contempt, believe them, but do not become them. Stay the course and keep your hands clean. And if you are a parent whose child has lost their way, do not rescue them from the fall. The fall itself may be the only teacher with enough authority to reach them. If this story moved you, I hope you will share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you have not yet subscribed to Family Revenge Stories, now is a good time. There are more stories just like this one waiting for you. Leave a comment below and tell me what part of this stayed with you. I read them and I am grateful for everyone. Thank you for being here. I will see you in the next story.